Imagine, if you will, that you're on a journey. It is not a journey that you ever thought you'd find yourself on, and well, it is not voluntary. This journey, well, it'll be long, and your travelling companions are, well, the guys forcing you on this expedition. Although it's going to take some time, you do know the destination, and you know that this journey is going to end in a very uncomfortable prospect. Your own painful demise. This journey is going to be your last. There are, however, several stops to be made on the way to the end, near places that you've been to with people that you know. It's almost like a goodbye tour. Now, what would you do in this situation? What would you say to your friends in the places as you pass them by? Ponder this for a moment as we discuss the next of the Apostolic Fathers, Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius is of course regarded as an Apostolic Father, who are the guys who took over once all the apostles had gone. He was the guy in charge of the Antioch church, you know, the one where Christians got their name. But alas, being in charge of this church led to similar fates as those of his predecessors. He was arrested by the Romans, and instead of being tried and executed in his hometown, he was going to be made an example of. His fate was to be taken to Rome, where he would be thrown into the Colosseum, where he would become food for the lions and entertainment for the baying masses. Like the Apostle Paul before him, Ignatius found himself on a one-way trip to Rome, so he decided to follow in his example, and this is how we know anything about him at all. Like Paul, Ignatius decided to write letters to the churches as he passed them by one last time, letting future generations like us into his thought processes and giving insights into the 2nd century church, and most importantly for this channel, some of the theological ideas that were floating around at the time. The 4th century historian, and regular name drop on this channel, Eusebius of Caesarea, tells us that 7 letters were written by Ignatius, and interestingly, one of them is addressed to another of the Apostolic Fathers, called Polycarp, and his is a tale that will follow after this one. Both men did know each other, and Ignatius had a lot of respect for him, and tradition says that they were both mentored by the Apostle John, one of the Sons of Thunder. He was also known as Theophorus, or God-bearer, and according to Eusebius, he was the 3rd guy to take over Antioch's church after Peter and a gent called Evodius. It was Emperor Trajan who was in charge of the empire at the time, and for whatever reason, be it as a gift or a way of passing the buck for his punishment, Ignatius was picked to be shipped off to Rome. On the way there, which seemed to take the scenic route, he was taken to Smyrna, then Troas, and then was eventually taken to Macedonia. Going via Philippi, he then ended up in Rome. Scholars think that Ignatius' journey to Rome wasn't exactly a priority for the soldiers who were escorting him, as he was actually allowed to visit a few congregations, write letters, and receive visitors. And with letters in mind, let's have a quick look at them, and see how things were going in the 2nd century church. First off is the Epistle to the Ephesians, a church that we know that the Apostle Paul also wrote to. Now, the main thrust of this letter is to obey the people in charge. I mean, Ignatius was a bishop himself, so there's obviously going to be a bit of bias here, and this carries on into his other letters, and it becomes something of a running theme. He was quite big on the church listening to the people who were running things, especially at this point in the church's history where many of these leaders had been appointed by the apostles themselves. Next up is his letter to the Magnesians, in response to a small delegation from Tralles, which also included Polybius, no, not that one, and some leaders from the Magnesian church, who came to visit him while he was in Smyrna. In his letter to them, he encourages unity, but also points out some really interesting things which show how the church was moving away from its Jewish roots. First off, he tells them to stop following the old Jewish woes, and secondly, he tells them to observe the Lord's Day and not the Sabbath. In other words, Sunday is the new holy day for us Christians, so this is some pretty significant stuff. Next up is a letter he sent off with Polybius back to Tralles in the appropriately named Epistle to the Trallians. Here we see the usual calls for unity and obeying your leaders, but also some interesting claims about Jesus, mainly that he was totally a real person who totally ate and stuff and was absolutely crucified. He really died and came back from the dead, definitely. So the question we have to ask here is, were people in the church claiming otherwise at this point? And the answer is, well, yes, they were. You see, the church we see today has had 2,000 years or so to figure out the whats and wherefores of its theology. But in the 2nd century, we were still figuring stuff out, even about 100 years after Jesus had been and gone. One of the things that we were trying to figure out was how the whole Jesus thing worked. I mean, that is the mechanics of it all. I mean, if he was actually God, how could he be human and die? Who was running things if God, the creator and sustainer of all things, was, not around? As in, like dead for 3 days. Well, there wasn't a set answer at this point, but there are a few ideas that the early church had come up with. Now remember, at this point there's only a few basic bits of Christian theology that were absolutely set in stone, and some of the answers to their many Jesus questions would eventually become branded as heresies, and those I will deal with in a separate playlist. But what Ignatius was talking about and tackling was a bit of Gnosticism, and in this letter specifically an idea known as Docetism. Now the short version of Docetism is that Jesus was not a flesh and blood person, but he was a projection of one, a phantasm, a spirit. This explains how he could do all those miracles and, well, not die after getting crucified. God was basically doing what we all do when we play video games. We control a custom character, but in this case with all the cheat modes on. Now this of course is a concept that Ignatius was rejecting, and it becomes another theme in his letters. Jesus was totally a human who did human things. He ate, he drank, he went to the toilet and things like that. This is a point he makes in various ways in his letters, but the questions about Jesus' humanity and how the mechanics of God becoming human worked would not exactly definitively be solved for quite a while, as there's still many questions about it even today. Next up is Ignatius' letter to the Romans, which takes a bit of a morbid turn. In this epistle, he implores the church in Rome not to try and stop his execution. You see, to Ignatius, being executed is as much as a Christian rite of passage as breaking bread or getting baptised. He saw it as part of his faith, and he really wanted to practice what he preached. Now, it's made clear in his letter that he'd never actually been to Rome or had any dealings with the church there, even mentioning that his words would not carry as much weight to the Roman church as the words of, say, Peter or Paul might have done back in the day. However, it is worth pointing out that in his letter to Rome, we see the emerging hierarchy in the 2nd century church. Bishops at the top, then elders, and then deacons, and this is actually the first written reference to it. Next up, we have his letter to the Philadelphians, which again sees a shift in Christian thought. In this case, it's a shift away from Jewish thinking and a further separation from Christianity's Jewish roots. In this letter, Ignatius again calls for church unity by following his superiors, but he also warns against people who are teaching Jewish laws, since, well, we're Christians, not Jews anymore. After this, we get his letter to the Smyrnians, where again he doubles down on his "Jesus was totally a real dude, guys" message. It also contains the first ever mention of a Catholic church, but in this context, Ignatius was talking about the church as a whole, the global church. Finally, we have the link to the next video in this series, as we get a letter written from Ignatius to his contemporary, Polycarp. Now, Polycarp was also taught by the Apostle John, and it's clear that both men respected each other. Now, this particular letter details how the problems in his home church of Antioch had all but been resolved, and it's in this letter that he asks his colleague to send them a letter of encouragement for doing so. He also asks him to follow his example and start sending letters out to the various churches, encouraging them into moral behaviour and staying away from the strange ideas that started spreading through the church. His letters all dealt with, though, we don't really have a lot of information about Ignatius after he'd written them. Now, Eusebius did write about him, but this was centuries after, and tradition does state that he did indeed meet his end, mauled by wild beasts as a colosseum full of people watched him. But his letters have been regarded as important, as through the ages it's been clear to see why. They give us a snapshot of the ideas and attitudes that were present in the church once its founders had all gone, how some concepts were being chosen over others, how the structure of the church was beginning to form. Next, of course, we are going to take a look at Polycarp, a contemporary of his, who also became regarded as an important figure in church history, who also met an ignoble end. So do feel free to subscribe if you want to get the next part in this long journey through church history, but until then, please do grab a drink Obey your elders and keep asking questions.